Welcome to this series of short presentations that describe a practical approach to managing risk. This is the third module of the series that describes how we should define objectives and the scope of the activity concerned with making a decision and managing risk associated with that decision. This is the step that is called in ISO 31000 establishing the context. The step is essentially concerned with preparing for the subsequent risk assessment, where we discover, understand and evaluate the risk. And at this stage we need to understand very clearly why we are managing risk. Why are we about to undertake a risk assessment, and also what are the organisation's objectives? In the previous module we talked about stakeholders, and at this stage it should therefore be clear who we should involve and who we should talk to as part of the process going forward. Critically, at this stage we need to understand the risk sources, and many organisations and individuals don't spend enough time understanding the external internal factors which give rise to risk, which are the sources of uncertainty for the decision we face and the objectives we're trying to pursue. Those external factors can include things such as the views of our customers and their needs, our partners, the weather, could be legal requirements, market conditions and so on. Internal factors can include processes and procedures, roles, responsibilities, resources available, reporting lines, budgets and so on. Also at this stage we have to think about how we're going to analyse and evaluate risk, particularly how we're going to estimate the level of risk. And finally, and certainly not least, we should be establishing a structure for the risk assessment and the risk management process going on to ensure that the way we discover risks and understand them is comprehensive and consistent with our needs and the time that's available. If we don't define these aspects at this stage, then we face a problem. For example, we can't then move on to discover and identify risks because we haven't appreciated the major source of uncertainty, the risk sources. We don't have a clear understanding of stakeholders and what are their objectives and how they should be involved. And because of that, it's not easy to plan communication and consultation, and invariably people either get left out or are told too late. We also need to prepare people for the subsequent discussions, whether they're in a workshop or a meeting, about risk. And we need to give them some briefing beforehand so that they're prepared. Most risk management exercises that go wrong seem to do so because we haven't been clear about our objectives and the scope of the activity. The second reason they go wrong is because we don't have a coherent structure for the activity and we wander around all over the place thinking about risks and evaluating and analyse them without following some systematic process. We also need to think about the tools we're going to use. We can't just sit in the room and think of risks. There are a wide range of tools available to enable us to discover risks, to understand them, and then act upon them. So if we don't spend enough time on this phase, quite frankly, we just waste everyone's time, and the resulting output and the decisions we make as a result of it are highly unreliable. I can't stress enough how important this preparatory phase is to both agree objectives for the organisation and for what we're trying to achieve as part of this particular decision, and also understand the scope and external internal environments. The information we generate at this stage of the process, particularly that concerning our organisations and our objectives and the objectives of our stakeholders, they help us both define and interpret our risk criteria. Often those risk criteria are predetermined for an organisation, but they do need to be translated into a particular application and for a particular decision. The scope and purposes of the study and the external and internal factors, those risk sources, help us define a structure which we normally call the key element structure, which then allows us to be comprehensive and coherent in the way that we discover and understand risk. So there are a series of steps we should undertake here. First of all, step one has to be defining our objectives. What are we trying to achieve by the decision that we're facing, and how does this relate to the organisation's overall purposes and objectives? And what is the scope? What's included and excluded? And how does this relate to the decisions that we are facing? What is the purpose of the subsequent risk assessment? What role does it play in our decision making? Step two is to revise and review what we've previously considered in Module 2, which is concerned with our stakeholders and their involvement. Particularly appreciating any conflict between their objectives and our own, and also appreciating how they should be involved through a process of communication and consultation. With step three, we start to focus on the risk sources that exist external to our organisation, and this slide suggests where they may sit. It will of course include the perceptions of values of external stakeholders, and it is vitally important that we do consider all these external factors, because often they lead to risk sources which is actually quite difficult for us to manage, but which quite frankly are the inevitable consequence of us wishing to do business in the way that we do it. Often they remain risks which are inherent, if we must use that phrase, inherent in the way we do business, in the market in which we sit, in the type of organisation of which we belong to. Practically, the way we define these external sources of uncertainty, these external risk sources, is to brainstorm them, generally starting from the widest perspective and focusing on to the narrowest perspective. We brainstorm all those factors, we group them together, and then we think against each factor about the implications for our objectives. The so what. So what if that would occur? If that exists, what does it mean for what we're trying to achieve in our organisation? We repeat this exercise in terms of internal factors, and I might mention it's very important at this stage to define what we mean by external and internal. Internal can just be within our organisation, or it can be within a particular project or an activity within that organisation. So everything that isn't internal therefore becomes external. Areas we should consider in terms of internal sources of uncertainty, internal risk sources, are things such as our culture, other groups and teams within the organisation, the structure, our capability and resources, and any constraints that we have to deal with, our procedures and policies, and the extent and limitations of our assets. Again here, we brainstorm all those factors and then think of the implications of those factors on our objectives, our ultimate purposes, the so whats. For example, if one of our external factors is that we have a poor organisational culture, the implications are that the organisation will find it very difficult to drive for continuous improvement and to increase its revenue by a stated amount within the next 12 months without the full and full-hearted and complete support of all its employees. Step 5 of the process involves thinking about our risk criteria. These are the rules that we have in place in our organisation by which we judge the significance of the risks we discover. We use these criteria in the risk analysis or understanding risk step of the process, and we obtain those risk criteria by looking at our high-level purposes and their outcomes and expressing those in terms of scales and limits. Once we've identified and discovered our risks, we can therefore analyse those risks in terms of significance to judge which are high and which are low using those criteria. We can also use those criteria to judge what's an acceptable and what's an unacceptable level of risk. Finally, and certainly not least, an important part of this step of the risk management process is to set up a structure that will follow subsequently. This is the structure that we'll use to brainstorm and discover the risks in the next step of the process, and by which we'll group things together. And the way we define this structure is to look at the external and internal factors which we've previously identified and group them together on a thematic basis. We also try and put them in some form of logical order. Quite frankly, I normally take the most obvious and easy element first, because that allows the conversation to start easily and to allow the people involved in the conversation to gain some confidence. I also want to make sure that the last element in the system catches anything that's left, to make sure that we are fully comprehensive. Typically, we would take about 30 minutes for each key element to discuss and understand the risks associated with that theme or that concept. And you'll see here, therefore, we have a 4 key element system, which implies that this sort of discussion would typically take about 2 hours. Practically, we have to look at our external and internal factors and think how we can group them together. And there are various schemes that we can follow. For example, if the risk assessment is concerned with a physical activity or an area of our organisation, we could split it up into some sort of geographical basis. We can also think about timing. So, for example, if we were looking at a project, we could use a structure based on the phases of the project, from concept through to pre-feasibility, feasibility, and then execution. If we were concerned with risk assessment associated with a work activity or a written procedure, we could use a work breakdown structure as the basis for the key element structure. We often also use stakeholder groupings as key elements. They are very effective. One thing we always avoid is using consequence types, for example, safety, environment, financial, as key elements, because risk is not normally related to just one of those. Risk leads to a range of consequences, and if we only consider risks in terms of the particular type of consequences, invariably we leave some risks out. It's called the cookie cutter syndrome. So what have we learnt here? The tips and tricks that I can tell you is to take time with this element, because it certainly saves a lot of time and anxiety later. Particularly, don't try and do this at the same time as you're having a discussion of risk in a risk assessment workshop. Do it several days beforehand and group all these tables together, we've discussed here these templates, into some sort of briefing note, send that to the attendees of the discussion a few days before the discussion takes place so that they can consider the matters and be prepared. Another tip is that unless the project or decision is sufficiently well defined, and particularly its objectives are well defined, it's really difficult to move forward. In fact, if the project manager or the organisation can't properly define the objectives of the decision being taken or the project being planned, then we should really stop the process at this point. That key element system we've just talked about does take some time, and when I prepare them, invariably I do one, I leave it a few hours, I come back to it, I modify it until it looks just right. But it really is worth the effort because it will expedite the subsequent processes of discovering and understanding risks. So in this module, we've learnt that we need to define and scope the risk management activity before we start and discover and understand risk. Particularly, we must define objectives and the scope of the activity and the external and internal sources of uncertainty. And those external and internal sources of uncertainty are then grouped together on a thematic basis to produce a structure, we call it a key element structure, which we'll use subsequently. Also, listing all those external and internal factors and their implications for our objectives enables people who will participate in the subsequent conversation to start thinking about risks. They started thinking about the scenarios, events, they postulate the things that could happen and what they could lead to that would have an effect on our objectives. And finally, we'd learned that grouping all these pieces of information together in one document, and we call it a briefing note, and then sending it out to the participants of the subsequent discussion makes a lot of sense because it allows those participants to prepare and be ready for the discussion. And we don't have to go through all this material again at the beginning of the workshop.